Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush peoples. It is always an honor and a privilege to be able to do so. Tonight, we are delighted to have with us Inés Hernández-Ávila, Molly McGlennen, and Casandra López. City Lights, together with Michigan State University Press, celebrate the publication of Indigenous Poetics. It's edited by Inés Hernández-Ávila and Molly McGlennen. Indigenous Poetics is a collection of essays by contemporary Native American poets who explore how poetry helps us to radically understand, to contemplate, and realize the deeper aspects of ourselves, the communities we live in, and our world at large. Indigenous Poetics brings together a remarkable range of contributions and contributors as they consider poetic expression as a tool intended to instruct, to act as a guide, to serve as a map, and finally, to emerge as a friend. Indigenous Poetics reveals poetry's crucial role in the flourishing of Native American and Indigenous studies and culture. Inés Hernández-Ávila is Nim Ipu, Nez Pierce, and Tejana, Texas Mexican. She is a poet, visual artist, and professor emerita of Native American Studies at University of California at Davis, and one of the 6 founders of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Her work has led her to collaborate with the Library of Congress, the Palabra Archive, working to increase the recordings of indigenous creative writers from Latin America. Her writing has appeared in the anthology The Shared Language of Poetry, Mexico and the United States. She has contributed poems to numerous journals. Joining her tonight will be Molly McGlennen. Molly McGlennen is of Anishinaabe and European descent and is a professor of English and Native American Studies, as well as the Anne McNiff Tatlock 61 Chair in Multidisciplinary Studies at Vassar College, where she has been responsible for building its Native American Studies program. Professor McGlennen is the author of 2 collections of poetry, and her poems have appeared in Poetry Journal, Academy of American Poets, Poems a Day, Red Ink, Yellow Medicine Review, amongst others. Her critical monograph, Creative Alliances, the Transnational Designs of Indigenous Women's Poetry, earned the Beatrice Medicine Award for Scholarship in American Indian Studies. So joining them tonight will be Casandra López. Casandra López is a California Indian, Tongva, Louisiano, and Chicana writer and the author of the poetry collection Brother Bullet. She has been selected for residencies at Storyknife, Hedgebrook, and MacDowell Colony. She is an assistant professor at UC San Diego and a Tongva language learner. Currently, she is working on the book We Are Singing Forever, which is a hybrid poetry collection. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Inés Hernández-Ávila, Molly McGlennen, and Casandra López. It's such a great pleasure and an honor to have you with us tonight. Welcome to City Lights.
Good evening, everyone. Peter and City Lights Bookstore for having us for this event. I wanted to begin by saying that I want to acknowledge how poets recognize each other beyond borders, ethnicities, languages, across ages and generations. As Native American and Indigenous poets, we belong to a world community of poets. We see each other, we're drawn to each other, whether we know the poet personally or not. The world of a poet's word speaks to us. There are hundreds upon hundreds of Native poets today in the United States, and an enormous number of Indigenous poets in this hemisphere, globally. We're grateful to all of our contributors for answering our call for submissions. This book is an intentional contribution and intervention to the field of Native American Indigenous studies, because often poetry and other literary genres are not taken as seriously as real, not so much scholarship, I wouldn't say the poetry is scholarship, but as real critical work. And by some of our colleagues, especially in the social sciences. And I know this by experience, and Molly and I've talked about this. Often departments or programs of NIS or AIS, American Indian Studies, might have one literature person And if the literature person is a literary studies scholar, they're more understood. If the literature person is a creative writer, perhaps not so much. So I just want to read a passage, one very small passage from our intro. One could say that creativity in all its forms illuminates an anti-disciplinarity trend working against Western disciplinary methods, which reinforce imperial legacies. Creativity and poetry specifically foreground our ways of forging a recreation of disciplinarity on our own terms. It's a process already emerging in the field, as NAS is ever dynamic and resisting Western paradigms. Art making, poetry, creative thinking is what can move us forward intentionally, especially in the times that we're living in now, as so many artists are saying to all of us around the world. So when I think of what we've done and what the poets in this collection do, they're manifesting how in their poetic practice, they are autonomous critical thinkers. They are dedicated to craft, to reveling in the love of language and of words. And there's even citational practices amongst poets. And in a way, it's a way that poets create community, or perhaps we should say strengthen community and nurture community amongst each other. And that's one of the things that I love. And several of us, all of us, at least us three right here today, have talked about the notion of kinship amongst poets and our particular peoples, and then the world at large. So I'm going to leave it right there and let Molly say a few comments as well, so that we can get into our conversation. So Kachiyoyo, thank you.
Miigwech, I'm so happy to be here. Miigwech to Peter and City Lights Books. I'm speaking to you from Muncie Lenape lands out here in New York. And I'm going to just talk really briefly about a bit about the contributors to this collection. And just to let you know that it was when Inez and I put out the call, it was an open call for submissions inviting Native American poets really from anywhere. But as we narrowed it in, it was all Native poets from the United States. And we've asked them to engage with a proposed set of questions. And primarily those questions were on the theme of poetry as a creative instrument of inquiry that Inez was just speaking about. And we reached out personally to several poets whose voices we thought would enhance the conversation. And we intended from the very beginning that the call be broad. And the essays that emerged, there's 15 total. Or I should say the chapters, they range from very narrative prose, poetic prose even, to more academic writing. But there's a real range. But I think one common thread is that, like all good poets, they're really leaning into a set of metaphors to think about what poetry, quote, allows us to do. And so we asked our contributors to ruminate and write on the idea if there is such a thing as Indigenous poetics, and if there is, what does that take into consideration? What does that look like right now? And so just as a way to give you a sense of the contributors in the book and just a tiny, tiny snapshot of their chapter, I'm going to read the names of each of the contributors in the order that they are in the book. And as sort of a cento, I realized today when I was putting this together, it reads like a cento. I'm going to read one line that Inez and I, in our introduction, pulled from each of the author's chapters that we think sort of crystallized, illuminated each of the contributors' main theme or point. So I'll read the contributor's name and then I'll just read that poetic, like it sounds like a poetic line of what poetry allows that poet to do. And if you want to know later, the chapter's title or poets, a little bit more about the poet's biography or their tribal affiliation, we can certainly answer any of those questions in the Q&A. So I'll start by saying that the great Dene poet, Esther Berlin, we're honored that she wrote the foreword to our book. So that begins the book. But what follows is this. 1, Kimberly Blazer. Poetry gestures beyond itself, beyond mere language. 2, Craig Santos Perez. When the page transformed into an ocean, each word became an island. The visible part of the word is its textual body. The invisible part of the word is the submerged mountain of meaning. 3, Casandra López. I turn to poetry out of necessity. 4, Natani Winder and Tanea Winder. We use poetry as a pathway to ignite a flame for therapeutic healing. 5, Layli Long Soldier. In writing or creating or making something, there's this process of accessing and relying upon the unseen. 6, Jake Skeets. For me, a blank page becomes an altar where the memory field is teased into existence. 7, Rain Proudhome Cranford and Carolyn M. Dunn. Story is foundational to our personal hermeneutics and also a lens or praxis inherent in our work. 8, Beth Piatote. Poetry has the capacity to illuminate not only the power of words, but the power of systems of thought. 9, Ku'ualoa Ho'omaniwanui. Because our world was born in poetry, Oiwi ways of being and knowing are forever informed by it. 10, Janet McAdams. Poets have always theorized. 11, Shana Nez. Poetry is an act of human agency and encapsulates what it means to be human. 12, C.J. Jackson. In poetry resides the place where I can teeter across multiple cable wires and not fear falling. 13, Molly McGlennen. Engaging poetry is always a petition for sentience, for understanding the signs. 14, Inés Hernández-Ávila. My love of literature would take me by the hand and lead me to poetry. And finally, 15, Michael Wasson. This hunger to hear is a poetics that my life is trying to locate. So that's just a taste of our contributors, and I think we're going to move into a conversation about each of our chapters in the book.
Okay, Kachiyoya. So one of the things I thought of starting with is pointing out that both Molly and Casandra do have MFAs in poetry, and I don't. I have 3 degrees in English, so as I say in my essay, I grew up in poetry as a social justice activist in the 70s in Texas. But I do think we have a lot in common. And one of the things that kept coming to me as I was reviewing our essays is that what we notice is we have a way of seeing, and seeing is important to us, and listening is important to us, and that listening, of course, comes to us from our own particular oral traditions, as Molly so beautifully points out in her essay about the Ojibwe tradition of children learning in the cradle board. But I think, when Casandra writes about being in the sweatshop with her mom and listening to all those sounds, that are around her, and Molly also talks about the sounds of nature and how there's a resonance with what she is knowing of herself as an Ojibwe woman with those sounds that she's hearing. So I just wanted to mention that and say that maybe we could each talk about a little bit about that. And I'll let you two start.
Cassandra, do you want to go?
Okay.
Yeah.
When I saw the call for this, the book, I was intrigued by it, but also a little intimidated because I don't tend to write academic work. But I was very encouraged by the sort of flexibility and the expansiveness of it, although there was this particular angle. And I just think it's a great opportunity to really think about my own sort of influences and pedagogy, as well as, for other, and I think it's an important book too, because many times I felt like sometimes that, in the sometimes people think it just happens, it just forms, a poetry just forms and just comes out of nowhere, but it's actually very like thoughtful and something that's studied. Yes, there is that foundation of emotion, but it's to get it to those like publishable place, it's actually like comes from a lot of like thought. And so, as I was thinking of my own journey, which was mentioned, we kind of have our own journeys. Um, and I do have an MFA, and I think my MFA, I felt in some ways I actually don't have an MFA in poetry, I have an MFA in fiction. And so I felt that I was learning fiction or prose in a very sort of Western sort of standard, like reading a lot of New Yorker, which they can be great, but there's this certain sort of way about them and a way about learning prose. And so I came to poetry as is mentioned, what I felt as a necessity because I had witnessed my brother's death, him being killed, and poetry felt like the only sort of outlet. And just so happened that I was then able to take some poetry classes. And I was able to take poetry classes with Dana Levin and Lucy Tapahanso. It's really like they both sort of mentored my my poetry and helped me. But as I was beginning to teach, I realized that I was sort of teaching in this sort of standardized way, but I wanted, because I was teaching at a tribal college and the whole college was about, indigenizing, I was like, oh, I need to rethink. And so I started to rethink not only my teaching, but my writing practice, and to look for indigenous theories and ideas, concepts that really connected and felt personable to myself. Um, and that's where I started to learn more about Rasquache, which is this we could say it's a theory, idea, concept, aesthetic, all those things, compasses all those things. It's a Nahuatl, coming from Nahuatl origins of this idea of making do, right? But it can often be used in a negative way. And so, but it has been reclaimed these days by Chicanx, Mexican um, writers, artists, um, who see the value in taking what you have and making something out of it. Even though it's like maybe not like perfect, right? And so using that idea of like, okay, things don't have to be perfect is how I um making use of what you have, even if you only have fragments, is what I try to carry on in my process and my practice. And it's been really helpful as I've been learning my language, my traditional language, Tongva. And so, um, even though it's not perfect, I'm still using it and hopefully getting better and better. And, I'm getting better and better. And, I started off with a word or two, and now I can write a full poem in the language, right? But that, and I still make mistakes, I still forget things, but the idea of rosquachismo is that, you is there some beauty in that? And so that that's really what the my essay is about. And also, like, a part of it too is has been like finding my voice. So I think this essay, it's I'm happy that I sort of dug into these, like, why these thoughts about why I feel so connected to Rosquache, because does have that help me um be able to articulate, why poetry has been so important in my life, right? I still love, prose and everything, but there's this excitement with poetry and so many things you can do with poetry, which is why that sometimes I feel much more connected to poetry. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I you have me thinking about so many things right now, Cassandra. I want to follow up with so many ideas that were all so cool. But to Inez's question, yeah, I had an MFA, got my MFA at Mills College, actually in Oakland, California, where I don't know why they accepted me with the poems, the type of poems that I wrote. I was studying with avant-garde feminists and language poets like the great Leslie Scalapino, Elizabeth Willis, Stephen Radcliffe. These are like, legends. Um, and surrealists, and they were really pushing me out of my kind of where I felt comfortable in the narrative mode. And I learned a lot. That was actually good for me. But it wasn't. Inez and I share this story that when I applied to the NAS PhD program, Inez, of course, being a professor there, was looking at, the people applying. And I told later, once I was accepted into the program, that I was accepted as a poet. They asked, Inez and others asked for my poetry. And I don't think it was until I got into my PhD program that I understood that it was okay to be writing the way I was writing. That I do have other people that I can look to follow the path in, that I didn't have to change myself. And one of the things that Inez taught me when I was her student in that program was that, and I always say this, that poetry is a place of total freedom. And I always take that to heart. And I tried to talk about that a little bit in the chapter as well. But yeah, Cassandra and Inez and I both, I think, share across our chapters this idea of listening, of voices, of memory, of like this homescape that's filled with sound and observation. And yeah, I have this quote from an Ojibwe scholar, Basil Johnson, in my chapter that says something like, after 4,000 to 6,000 hours of listening, a child utters their first word, which is, right, the child in their cradle board in their first year, just listening to everything around them and those sounds of the birds, the insects, their mother's voice, whoever, their family, the wind. In Ojibwe, they would say the sisigwad, the way the wind makes a sound through the trees, right? All of that preempts speaking. And so I think there is elements of that in poetry, right? That we hear things that preempt even the very words that we want to put down on the page. Um, so yeah, maybe I'll stop there because I hand it off to Inez if you want to respond to some of that, but that's what
Yeah,
I'm thinking
I
about.
just want to say really briefly, thank you for that, and both of you. And I just, I'm the oldest one, right? I'm 78, so I'm from a very different generation from Molly and Cassandra. So when I got my undergraduate degree and my master's and doctorate in English, even though I did it because I love literature. As a child, I loved literature. I read all the time. And when I couldn't decide what to do as an undergraduate, so I thought, okay, I'll do literature. And I was an English and Spanish major as an undergraduate. So I read a lot of Spanish literature and Spanish American, or what is now Latin American literature. But it wasn't, but that moment in my life wasn't so friendly, in that I was one of 3 people of color in the graduate program, and I never saw the other 2. And I felt very constrained. I felt very constrained in that program, even though I did well. I did fine. But in around 1970, I got involved in the Chicano movement in Texas, and all of a sudden this flourishing of literature happened. As we're having citywide poetry readings and national poetry readings, were called Festivales Floricantos, where people would come. Nobody was paid. Everybody had to get there on their own. The organizers just made sure people had a place to sleep and had food to eat. And there's no hierarchy, no featured poets. Everybody was equal. that was really my learning space, for poetry. That was, where I just sort of woke up. I woke up and it was almost as if this was what I'd been waiting for, right? I'd been waiting for this. I'd been waiting to hear not just poets from the United States, but from Mexico, from other parts of Latin America, other indigenous poets. The Latin American New Song movement was incredibly influential to me. Violeta Parra and Victor Jara and poets like Otto René Castillo from Guatemala. I mean, as I read them, and I thought, oh my God, poetry can do this. And it's not that I didn't realize it before reading English literature, reading from a Western perspective, but that's when I've found my way. I found my way. And I think, getting back to the idea of the gaze, and because Casandra says in her essay, that when she goes home, she's constantly seeing her home in new ways. And that's it's a validation of those aspects of where we come from that were considered, and she says, in her essay, low art or rascuache, or not as sophisticated or refined and so forth as mainstream literature. And it's part of our healing process, right? It's part of our healing process, or decolonizing ourselves from having had embedded in ourselves, having ingrained in ourselves these false notions of who we are as human beings, and realizing that it was all a lie, right? And so we've seen in different ways, and we know how to cherish and honor those aspects that other people might look down on, but for us, they mean everything to us. And one of that, for example, in indigenous communities, and in communities that are not so well off, we share. We share. And I'll stop there, but Molly or Casandra, if you have something you'd like to nudge us into, I'm welcome.
Sandra, did you want to respond to that, to your?
I don't have a response right now. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think here.
Well, it doesn't have to follow what I said. We could go on to.
Yeah, okay, this is what I'm thinking right now, what you're reminding me of. We have this quote in the introduction by Joy Harjo. We honor four poets as sort of the forebears of the work that we are engaging and hoping, advancing in the field, and which is Joy Harjo, Kimberly Blazer, and Scott Momaday, and Simon Ortiz. And we quote Joy where she says, and I'm forgetting exactly where we put this in the intro, but it's every poem has ancestors. And where we took that, and where I've been thinking a lot about recently in my own work, in both my poetry and in my scholarly work, is that we take up that idea, I think, a lot through this idea of a methodology or a method of acknowledgement when we write. I think we are relating to one another as we write. Like, relationality is at the core of the poetics. I think across all the writers, this is something that comes up again and again. And as in Memory Strings, in your chapter, you talk about poetry's power to make a heart-to-heart connections. Cassandra, you have similar, in your book, in your collection, Brother Bullet, like it really is on this like interpersonal spirit level connection, right? To communicate with other beings that might not be here, that might not be human, right? And That's actually something you, Inés, you and George Longfish talked a lot about. George, the great artist, Tuscarora Seneca artist that was a colleague of Inés's and was a mentor of mine as well at UC Davis, that artists working on this level of spirit, which is always like captivated, my, I don't know, obviously it captivated my attention, but it was something that I think about and also the idea of intuition as we write. These are things that I've been taught, right? Again, going back to my comments before, like intuition, spirit, those weren't words that were mentioned in my MFA program, right? Creativity, sure. But where does that come from? That comes from our, something what I'm calling in my chapter original vibrations, like these original homelands, these places, these original homescapes that we, even if we don't live there presently, we are always calling back to, right? They're informing our creativity. So I'd like to talk more about like that spirit and intuition, if that's something you want to talk about, either one of you. Um, that this idea of every poem having ancestors and like what that means for us, if that's something that's um, catching your interest right now. Or
Um,
also too, I was gonna say, Inez, like your memory strings, like all this ancient knowledge, right, is present, I think, and language learning as well. That's another kind of like ancientness to an Indigenous poetics that I think a lot of us are getting at.
yeah, and I think one of the things we should say about the volume is that several of the contributors do focus on Indigenous language revitalization as an aspect of what they're writing about. Beth Piatote is with Phil Kashkash is the founder of Lukupsime, which is a group that I belong to. Of it was 7, now it's 6, but we're thinking about adding more Nez Perce writers to work on our language, to do language work through the writing of poetry, through creative writing, and actually not just poetry, but through creative writing. And this is something that I've seen in so much in Mexico. They're so far ahead of us, actually. There is a National Association of Writers in Indigenous Languages, and in Chiapas, there is a state center for Indigenous Languages, Art, and Literature, and one of their mantras is to promote language revitalization through creative writing, and it's working because it gets people excited. It gets their young people excited to know that they know their language and they can create in their language, and they will be honored when they do public readings in their language, translated in Spanish. And so that's just a phenomenon that's happening, it's a flourishing throughout Mexico, but certainly in Chiapas, where I've spent a lot of time. And I do see it as one of the things that I've noticed, and this is, I mean, it's a far reach, and I have no, it's a feeling that I have. But when I talk to my colleagues in Chiapas, and there are people who speak their language, but that we're talking in Spanish, but they talk poetically. I mean, their everyday language is poetic. Their messages, their text messages, or their messages on Facebook are poetic. Just these incredible, just hellos that talk about, wishing you well, the Mother Earth, be with you, and so on and so forth. I mean, I can't even replicate how they deliver their messages. And I'm thinking that must be that has to do with the fact that they know their languages. And I'll just say this, that in Nez Perce, in our language, Nimiputenki, and in our belief system, we are told that we should always lead with the heart. Mm-hmm. So that has something to do with it. And I think all of us probably, each Casandra and Molly and I all get that, right? That it's poetry is not just an intellectual exercise. It's a feeling. It's the feeling that's important, that is there, that we're communicating. And it's not even that we're trying to, it's part of part of who we are as poets. And also up there, maybe Casandra might want to say something.
And there's so many thoughts going on, but I love the Joy Harjo ancestors. It's something that I teach my students, and we look. One of the things we do is we look at, and you can see this. Like whether you're talking about actually like human ancestors or something more spiritual or non-human, yeah, and when I show them, and sometimes you can it's when you're talking about Inez, when you're talking about how poets document, right? Whether it's a cento or an after poem, and you can see this, like if you take, I show my students an excerpt from Zitkala Shah's work, then Layli Long Soldier, and then most recently Erin Marie Lynch's work that all reference each other. And so in that way, it's a very clear reference and drawing from each other. And so, you can see the mind of the poet working, the writer kind of working and drawing from that, but also taking from their own experiences. Um, so that's like really, it's great to show students, right? And it's something I also like want to replicate in my own work. As I'm learning my language, I've been very much inspired by other Indigenous poets who are learning their languages. Um, and I hope my work can inspire them as well. And I do have poems that are, after poems because I've been so affected by, someone, especially someone who's writing in their language, and I'm, trying to figure it my way out. Um, and and one thing I was thinking about, Inez, too, as you were talking about, because in your essay you talk about like the activism of the 70s, right? And your experiences with with writers south of the border as well. And so um, sort of maybe how we can see this as a contemporary experience, like the need for poetry. Sometimes people's like, what good are words or what, right? But like in the 70s we really saw it play out, and how we might see it again, or how we are seeing it play out, may especially with with our different histories and experiences, how that might be. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Right. Yeah. No,
I just wanted to add something. I love this conversation right now because one of the things that I think I've noticed for a long time is just this practice of dedication, but that Native poets have with one another. Um, and one time Kim Blazer told me, she writes about this too, but Kim Blazer, who's in the book, told me that it's not an anxiety about influence, it's a celebration of influence. And I love that idea because it truly is that we want to talk to one another. And that I think is part of the activism, that we stand together in opposition, right? We stand alongside one another, not in opposition, but aside um, along one another, side by side. And I think just that is an activist move, is a type of politics that we, I don't know, that yes, we draw on a community of stories, on our own oral traditions, on our own indigenous terms, but we're also like emphatic about dedicating, honoring, connecting, citing, as Inez said, one another in this effort. And I think that is innate, like in its essence, political. Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say that. And I know, Inez, you probably have a lot to say about this as well. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, thank you for saying that, but I just wanted to add that, I've always thought a lot about, the words that we use, right? The words that our community in native people use sovereignty, over and over and over again for historical reason, because we have the nation to nation agreements with the United States government. But it's a loaded word, right? But we have not only political sovereignty now, but visual sovereignty and intellectual sovereignty, linguistic sovereignty, and so forth. And in Mexico and the rest of Latin America, the word is autonomy, which I prefer actually to sovereignty. But both of those mean self-determination, right? And I just I'm just constantly reminded of how people who engage in the practice of the arts are autonomous beings. They are, or at least, we're doing our best to be connected to our own originality, our uniqueness, right? And not be bound by paradigms, and not be bound by prescriptive rhetoric, and not be bound by categorizations that sometimes political movements feel, tell you that you have to use this language or be this certain way in order to fit. And the artists just bust that all out of the water, just blow it out of the water. I mean, because the whole point is what is it that is yours, and to use, to make reference to Netzahualcoyotl, who was a poet, a Nahuatl poet writing before, invasion. It's when he says in one of his poems, what is there to life? What is there to life? And it's a beautiful poem, but it ends with, we leave at least flowers, we leave at least songs. And that means we leave what we've created, and what we've created stays, even though we are no longer here. Our bodies leave, but our spirit stays in the work that we've left. And when I think about the times we're living in right now, which is, there are not even sufficient words to name what we're going through. It is the artist. And so many of the artists are saying that, right? It is the artist. We have to remind us that to go beyond rhetoric, to go beyond program language, to go beyond buzzwords, to go beyond, text kind of, messaging, as if that makes us seem like we know what's going on. It's the, we need people who will contest all of that and question and inquire, because that's our right. That's our right as human beings, and not just on behalf of other human beings, but on behalf of all of life, right? So, so thank you for bringing that up, because it reminded me of autonomy, and I wanted to say that about that.
Absolutely. And I think too, the poet and the artist's commitment to deep observation, deep contemplation, witnessing, attention, and these, acts of attention that, we practice like a muscle, like that we take very seriously. And I think those are the only interventions I think they're going to crack open that which is, placate and flattened and trite, and it just, we're in a knot presently that we're not moving, and we're sick. And I think too, poetry is also, and creativity is a type of medicine, personally in our bodies, but I think also it's a gift. And if you're thinking of it on that level, which I think we all are, right? It's what we can do, what we can offer, but it's not as if it comes from nowhere. It's deep. I think that was an important point that we make, in our introduction as well. It comes from deep, deep, critical, creative contemplation, observation, to try to discover things that you can't otherwise discover or understand. So yeah. But I see that it's 10 till. I don't know if we wanted to talk more with some more questions, or if we wanted to read a little bit, or just trying to be the timekeeper.
I'm I'm fine with whatever we choose to do.
Cassandra, how do you feel?
Whatever. Do you have any more pressing questions that you want?
Well, can I be a little bit, can I ask you one final question, Cassandra?
Yeah, sure.
And maybe this will open up to a little bit of reading too. I don't know. But I'm like obsessed with that line that poetry welcomed you in in this moment of distress, or the way that Brother Bullock came together.
Hmm.
You start to talk about it in your chapter in Indigenous Poetics, and I'm just I'm just wondering if you would say more about like how poetry, as opposed to say fiction, right, that you're quote unquote trained in, right?
Yeah.
How poetry welcomed you, like what that welcoming was, or what that invitation was, or the therapy, the therapeutic, or the healing mechanism of it. I love that last poem in the grove, and you have it's just such a regenerative, loving moment in the last poem of your book. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the welcoming aspect.
Sure. I think I had only written one poem before I started writing, like taking a poetry class. Also, like I did not study in undergraduate. I didn't study literature or creative writing. I studied apparel design. Um, I know as you mentioned, like, I grew up my parents, I have creative family, but not in the way of like writing, right? And so my mother was a seamstress, my grandmother as well, worked in a sewing factory for a portion of my life. And so that's kind of where I was like angling to go into. But I kind of found my way into fiction because I wanted to represent, or I had read a book where there that took place um like near my hometown, and I was like, oh, I could do this. Um and so this is not to talk down about fiction because I see all the possibilities, but in that moment of distress, like it felt like fiction didn't matter anymore. W- like when I'm like surviving, trying to survive, and I'm not able to even comprehend that I have survived. And so, like, there was just so much emotion, and so I felt like poetry was the only conduit that I could sort of wrangle my emotions into, that it just felt too much to try to fictionalize it or even write it in nonfiction. And I'm so happy that I had Dana Levin, who was just really, who herself writes about grief as well, and who was just like ready to let the poem, was one, a great foundational teacher of poetry, but also letting able to let the poems be what they were going to be, right? And I'm still very like the book's very narrative. I'm still like coming from that narrative background. Um and so there's that. But yes, poetry was that anchor for me. Um, and I say I learned how to write poetry from writing the book, right? You you just learn how to do it because you keep at it. And so that I also I think for myself, and I kind of mentioned this in the essay, I also have a lot of trauma, like not well, it's like trauma, but it sounds like I'm being hyperbolic, but from writing with English. I feel like I would get critique about my use of English, like that people didn't believe I was an English speaker, like that English was my first language, and so I felt very insecure about my grammar. But poetry really, there's so much freedom in breaking the rules, and who cares if you have a comma splice, right? So it's not, it felt like a freedom in with that, where I then didn't have to also worry about my grammar and my use of English. Um, and I will say all oddly enough, learning my traditional language, learning Tongba has helped me kind of with my going through my sort of trauma with the English language, because it's helpful to know grammar when learning another language, because you're learning the grammar structure, and so you kind of like, and then I know, as you're talking about like a trilingual poem, what will happen when I'm trying to find a word in Tongva, but I don't know it, then my mind will go, instead of going to English, it goes to Spanish. And then, and so in my mind, it's like synapsing, it's like popping all over. And so, and you could do that with poetry, I feel like. But I mean, but that's sort of like how my brain was working. Um, so yeah, that's where I felt like poetry at that time, especially. I just start to write prose nonfiction when I felt like poetry was a little bit, I didn't want to be as concise or compressed. When I wanted to be more expansive, I did start to go more toward. But I will say, writing poetry really improved my prose. Like it really, that intention to detail and to the line. So,
Yeah.
I I like to follow up with a personal comment that you made me think of is that, because I'm of a much, I'm much older than the two of you. So I remember when I was writing poetry in Texas in the 70s, I was doing all kinds of readings. I mean, we would start marches with poetry readings, we would start rallies with poetry readings, and um um and I felt very comfortable moving back and forth between Spanish and English. But then when I came to California and I started trying to get some of my poetry published, editors didn't know what to do with me because they wanted me to either be English or Spanish, but not they didn't want poems that were using both languages, which is, in retrospect, ridiculous, because poets from around the world do that, right? And maybe, French and English or whatever, but somehow my identity as a Nez Perce woman and a Texas Mexican woman, I felt was constantly challenged because my poetry was often employing both languages and sometimes in the same poem. And so that was pretty heartbreaking for me. So it's really good to see you, Casandra, very comfortable with your identity, and everybody knows that it's your identity, and they're welcoming it. And even, talking about scholars like someone like David Martinez at Arizona State University, who is Otam and Mexican American and out about it, right? Because, it the times have changed, right? The times have changed, thankfully, for the better. But I don't want to end on a, so Molly, you could take, end it with a positive.
Did you say Molly? End it with a positive? Well, one of the things that, yeah, one of the things that Simon Ortiz talks about very early on, maybe it was from the 70s, is using the English language to, in a way, poetry allows us to use the English language without its colonial baggage, something to that effect. That's not a quote from him, but that's the idea. And yeah, a lot of the poets in this collection are thinking about, even if we only know some, a few words in our language, or if we're very early learners, and I count myself as one of those people, like a toddler, level, um, we still study it as a system of thought, to use Beth Piatote's word phrase. And poetry allows us to delve into that thought, that system of thought, to be able to, even if we're not working in Anishinaabe Moan or our own language, we are still, with poetry, we're still able to convey, right, the beauty and the dynamic nature and the intellect of our languages, what it can do and how it can move and be in the world and what it teaches us. So poetry is a teacher in that way. We're learners. It can help us with language learning, but it also can be the way that even if we don't know our languages as much as we want to, we can still be teaching in some ways, humbly, right? But it allows us to explore that. And so, yeah, that I think that's one of the beauties of poetry and its connection to this kind of current language revitalization effort, right, among a lot of Indigenous peoples and communities.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that, in our group, Le Coupe Sime, which is, as I said, comprised of now 6 members. One of the members is Angel Sabata, who is a really creative, performance artist, poet, storyteller. She is the Nez Perce language instructor at Lapwai for the Nez Perce Nation. And I remember one time when we first started getting together as the group, I voiced my apprehension because I'm the oldest member of the group, but I know the least, of our language. And yet I've been really working at it, but I'm still far behind, the other 5 people. And Angel said something really important that I want to say to anybody in the audience who's also, working on your language and wanting to incorporate your language into your writing, whatever kind of writing it is, whether it's poetry, fiction, or essays or whatever. She just told me simply, she said, don't worry about it. She said, we need you. We need you. And that's, I really received that in my heart. And I think we all have to remember, because those of us who are, behind, there's no reason for us to feel embarrassed or apprehensive. We're doing it. We're trying. I'll probably, as I said in my essay, I'll probably be working on this in my next life. But we're doing it, and it's revelatory.
Right.
To work with our languages. It's incredibly astonishing to learn through our dictionaries and through our peers. It's a whole other world, for each of us. And again, those are autonomous worlds that we respect from nation to nation, from people to people. Right? So I think we're at 7. So probably we need to do the Q&A.
Yeah.
Derek pops in and says, this book is excellent. People should get it. 2 questions. They're both related. And number 1, how do you envision this work being used in the future? More essays from different writers, deeper dives of topics. And 2, what do you hope the work may inspire?
Well, I'll just go as a teacher. I think it's really hopeful to have this like thoughtful discussions from these various writers. Um, Molly, I was thinking of I'm teaching a poetry class um in the fall. Well, 2 poetry classes. And one of them was thinking of assigning your essay because the of that emphasis on like looking, and like that kind of which I think as poets is something, a skill that we, both the sound, hearing, we talked about that sound, but then so hearing and then looking and just taking that time. And so I think, students can find it really helpful, other writers, and so I would hope that people see that how thoughtful, or how much um Indigenous people have ideas about their work, that we will end up seeing more of these kind of books out there.
Yeah.
I think I would say that I hope there are more books like this to come, and we made a decision, as Molly mentioned earlier, to focus on the United States. But I would love to see a book that is hemispheric, but it would involve a lot of translation. It would involve, essays from Mexico, Central and South America, would most likely be written in Spanish, would have to be translated, and the ones in English from the United States and Canada would have to be translated into Spanish. But that's my yearning, my deep, deep, deep yearning is for Indigenous peoples in this hemisphere to come to know each other, to remember each other, and not be divided by national boundaries or or languages, colonial languages. So that's one of the things I would hope would come out of this. But obviously, I think, the essays it's a beautiful collection of essays by strong, inspiring poets. And so I hope that the book will be inspiring to other poets and individuals who are embarking upon the path of poetry.
Okay, you can ask them. Yeah, I agree. You can go ahead with another question.
Okay. RJM says, this is so affirming for all of us learning our languages to move forward without judgment. Thank you for sharing, especially as I have that long perspective. Can't wait to read. Wonderful poets. Thank you for this work. Nancy says, yes, the DNA Reader is used at UNM for Intro to Native American Literature, Professor Sarah Hernandez. And that's what we have now. Anyone else? Yes, let's see. Then Nancy says, Navajo Nation important to New Mexico.
Well, I'll just add, if people have other questions, feel free to ask them. But I was going to say that first off, I love looking back at it now, because we put this to rest. I can't remember how many months ago, but looking back over it, it is actually very teachable. But it's also very readable. Like I loved going back and just kind of rereading, in preparation for tonight, just to kind of relish in the beauty of the language. That, it's poets writing about why they write, and so one of the things that I noticed is we're writing in prose, but it was almost like I was writing prose poetry. I was just stretching lines out, and that's what I was doing. I wasn't paying attention to writing a full independent clause. I could be poetic. And I was finding like my stride and finding kind of a sweet spot, which made me think, is there something else here that we can continue to do? But to follow up on both Cassandra and Inez's points, it's, yeah, I think it's poets, for so long, and maybe still now, sadly, when you talk to people who don't know Native people or don't know much about Native poetry, I think they have sort of a contrived idea of a stereotypes, like a stereotypical Indian poem and what that should look like and sound like and what its themes should be, right? We know these things, right? Very stereotypical. And I think this is just 15 examples of these, amazing Indigenous poets setting the terms, saying this is what it is. Um, and maybe the two of them were, Inez and Cassandra were asking earlier about this idea of I talk about a poetics of possibility. I think that's what it is, right? It's like refusing those stereotypes, you know, and saying this, we can do all, like there's docu-poetics is so huge right now with Indigenous poets and language learning. And so it's just people are really taking off. So it's really readable. So for that reason, I hope people get their hands on a copy.
I would agree. As I said, I don't write much academic work, but I read academic work, and
Right.
sometimes it could be a slog. Even if I love the
Yeah.
topic, it could really be a slog to get through. Even if it's very edifying. And so I would totally agree with that about the and I think that's also is because of you two as editors who that did that sort of encouragement to let our sort of poetic styles come out. And so I appreciate that as as a contributor, feeling that openness to that. And earlier today, I was reading, one of my colleagues had posted this PDF book called Indigenous Water Views, that kind of does, and that's what you're talking, like hemispheric, um, and it it also kind of hit me the same way, that it was also very accessible, very lyrical, different Indigenous people writing about water and the importance of water. And so I think that's maybe a natural, or I don't know, something that comes out in Indigenous scholarship is that especially poets, especially creative people, we see that. So yeah, but I want to thank you as editors that you kind of cultivated that space for us so that what we came up is I think very accessible.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, there don't appear to be many more questions, and I think we are coming to the top of the hour. Any final thoughts before we wrap?
I want to send a shout out to Harriet Mullen. I'm so glad to see her in the list of participants. The wonderful poet and someone I met a long, long time ago. So I'm really happy to see. I'm sorry, and I just wanted to acknowledge her.
And we are hosting her in September, actually, at the store. So check out our calendar, everyone.
Yes, awesome.
Beautiful. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and thank you to my my collaborators here tonight, and thank you, Peter. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation.
Oh, and there's thank you to everyone who came. We really, really appreciate your listening and being with us.
Thank you.